The Fall of Hollywood. How One Merger Changed Everything. The Fall of Hollywood. How One Merger Changed Everything. Complete documentary. Full version, 3,000 words. Prologue. The day the lights went out for more than a century, Hollywood was an empire. A place where dreams were shaped, stars were manufactured, and stories came to life on giant screens that illuminated dark rooms on every continent. But every empire falls. And sometimes, the fall begins quietly. On an apparently ordinary Tuesday, a piece of news spread so fast it felt like fiction. Netflix buys Warner Brothers. Within minutes, news agencies crashed, stock prices swung violently, and analysts split between disbelief and panic. Something had ended that day, and something new, colder, and more calculated had begun. The merger was not just a business transaction. It was a cultural earthquake. And for many experts, that moment represented the definitive collapse of old Hollywood, a model that resisted for decades but did not survive the age of algorithms. It was the beginning of the biggest transformation since 1920, when sound cinema ripped power away from silent film stars. And just like in that historic shift, many didn't notice the change until it was too late. The end of a system. To understand why this merger was so destructive for Hollywood, you must first understand the fragile structure that supported the industry in recent years. Hollywood lived on a tripod: movie box office, international sales, traditional television, and all three were dying. Movie theaters had faced continuous decline since the 2000s. Audiences preferred binge-watching series at home. Traditional TV was losing relevance. International box office became unpredictable. Production costs increased while profits decreased. Netflix watched this like a patient predator. While Hollywood insisted on old formulas, Netflix created its own ecosystem. No movie theaters, no programming grid, no international barriers, no intermediaries. The company knew exactly how many people watched every minute of every production, something no traditional studio could measure accurately. And when Warner, overloaded with debt and bad strategic decisions, began to falter, Netflix attacked. It wasn't just the purchase of a studio. It was the first clear sign that Hollywood was no longer in control of itself. The slow death of traditional studios. The merger triggered a chain reaction that exposed what everyone feared, but no one said out loud. The traditional studios were broke. After the announcement, market analysts explained what Hollywood ignored for years. Warner wasn't bought because Netflix wanted to expand. Warner was bought because it was already falling. Its debts exceeded billions. Its model was outdated. Its franchises were worn out, and its structure was too heavy to compete with digital companies. The other studios watched in silence, but they knew they were in the same boat. Paramount faced record losses. Universal survived almost exclusively thanks to Fast and Furious and Jurassic World. Sony depended on luck with leased franchises. Disney, despite its strength, was starting to feel the weight of its own failed bets. For the first time since the 1930s, Hollywood no longer looked like the center of the world. It was just another industry trapped in the past. The Netflix-Warner merger simply exposed the inevitable. Studios that once set trends now chased relevance. And the question was clear. If Warner fell, who would be next? The rise of cheap and fast films. With the merger, a new production model gained strength. Low-cost films, produced quickly and tested by algorithms. Netflix always preferred quantity, not because it didn't value quality, but because it understood something Hollywood took too long to accept. Modern audiences don't consume cinema. They consume time. And to fill time, volume is essential. Thus, series and films began to be created almost industrially. Pre-formatted scripts, up-and-coming, inexpensive casts, tight schedules, simultaneous shoots, accelerated post-production titles shaped by artificial intelligence. The goal was no longer to create masterpieces. It was to create enough content to keep the user hooked. This slowly killed the glamour of cinema. Renowned directors complained about interference. Writers denounced creative reduction. Actors became replaceable. Old Hollywood, which took years to develop a film, couldn't compete with a company capable of producing 50 projects in the time a studio produced 3. The result? Cinema became a statistic. The day cinema began to die. Of all the impacts of the merger, the most painful for traditional audiences was the slow death of movie theaters. It didn't happen all at once. It happened like a silent disease. First, the number of theatrical exclusives decreased. Then entire franchises abandoned theaters completely. Finally, major complexes closed, unable to compete with streaming. Theaters that once showcased films that defined generations now showed only occasional blockbusters and nostalgic reruns. Cinema stopped being a social event and became a cultural memory. Netflix tried to save some chains, but the audience had already moved on. Cinema, as a collective experience, was dying, and with it, the magic that defined Hollywood. Directors like Christopher Nolan, Denis Villeneuve, and Greta Gerwig gave emotional interviews saying that art was being sacrificed for convenience. But the truth was cruel. The audience voted with the remote. When algorithms make decisions, the scariest part of the merger wasn't corporate, it was philosophical. By combining its analytical power with Warner's vast catalog, Netflix created what many called the brain, an algorithmic model capable of predicting which stories will succeed, which actors generate more retention, what duration keeps viewers engaged, which music is most emotional, which narrative structure works best when a scene should end. This model didn't just influence films, it decided films. Scripts were altered based on invisible metrics. Characters were removed if they didn't generate enough engagement. Subplots were discarded for being too complex. Filmmakers complained, but Netflix argued, "We are giving the audience exactly what the audience wants." But was that true? Or was the algorithm shaping human desires? Cinema, which had always been art, was becoming engineering. And for many, this was the true fall of Hollywood. The collapse of pop culture. Before the merger, pop culture was fragmented. Marvel, DC, Star Wars, Harry Potter, Pixar, Paramount, Universal. Each dominated a piece of the collective imagination. With the merger, that map changed drastically. Netflix now controlled DC Comics, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, Looney Tunes, Matrix, The Lord of the Rings, television production, all of HBO. It was too much content in the hands of a single company. And this created an unexpected consequence: the standardization of creativity. With one company deciding what gets attention, fans noticed something strange. Everything began to look the same. Trailers had the same rhythm. Visual effects had the same aesthetic. Actors followed the same style. Scripts had the same format. Narratives had the same emotional structure. The creative diversity that was the heart of Hollywood was being slowly suffocated. And for the first time, experts began talking about cultural homogenization, a phenomenon that turned art into predictable product. The war Hollywood could not win. While Netflix dominated, Hollywood tried to resist. Disney launched ambitious projects but faced audience fatigue. Amazon invested billions but lacked soul. Paramount and Universal struggled to stay alive. The real enemy of old Hollywood wasn't Netflix. It was time. The world changed faster than the studios could react. Netflix understood something everyone else ignored. Modern audiences are not loyal. They are volatile. They consume what appears first, what is faster, what grabs attention for a few seconds. And Netflix mastered exactly that. Hollywood fought like a giant, but fell like a relic. The side few people saw: the artist's pain. Behind the merger, There was an invisible war. Directors lost autonomy. Writers saw their stories distorted. Actors became replaceable pieces. Crew members lost jobs to automation. Netflix promised to democratize art, but many artists felt the opposite. Independent projects disappeared. Art house films were swallowed by a wave of fast content, and a silent fear spread through the industry, the fear that cinema was losing its soul. Some say movie theaters were temples, and streaming turned everything into a supermarket. Others argue that the merger created opportunities for new talent to emerge without Hollywood's old closed doors. Maybe both sides are right, but for those who lived through the golden years, the feeling was clear. A world had ended. The audience that changed forever. If the fall of Hollywood had a culprit, it wasn't Netflix, it was the audience. The new generation has no patience for long waits, annual releases, or rigid structures. They want immediate access, explained endings, constant content, personalization, interaction speed, and Hollywood didn't offer that. Netflix did. The modern audience no longer wanted to watch what Hollywood considered good. They wanted to watch what they considered convenient. The merger simply accelerated an inevitable trend. Cinema stopped being an experience. It became a habit, and habits can be reshaped by algorithms. The future. Nobody predicted. With the merger established and traditional studios weakened, new projections emerged. Experts envision 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Total monopoly. Netflix absorbs smaller studios, becomes the planet's main producer, controls everything from animation to scientific documentaries. Cinema becomes a uniform industry. Scenario 2. The war of ecosystems. Disney, Apple, Amazon, and Netflix battle not only for films, but for entire digital lives. Each creates its own universe, virtual reality, exclusive formats. The audience chooses a faction. Scenario 3. Independent revival artists reject the corporate model, create their own platforms. Independent productions rise again. Art house cinema finds new ways to survive. No one knows which will win. Perhaps all will coexist in permanent conflict. Conclusion. The merger that brought down the old world. The acquisition of Warner by Netflix didn't destroy Hollywood overnight, but it opened an irreparable crack. It showed that tradition doesn't guarantee survival. Debt destroys empires. The audience changes, technology wins. Art must adapt, and no studio, no matter how legendary, is safe. Hollywood didn't fall with an explosion. It fell with silence. A silence that echoed in empty theaters, declining box offices, abandoned scripts, shut-off cameras, streets once lit by premieres now covered by the shadow of streaming. The Netflix-Warner merger wasn't just a corporate shift. It was the symbol of an era that died, and of another that was born. An era where algorithms decide what we watch, where productions are manufactured like products, where stories are shaped by human behavior, not the other way around. Old Hollywood fell, but cinema lives on in another form. And maybe, in the end, that is the real lesson. Cinema never belonged to the studios. It belonged to the audience, and the audience chose to change.